The night in the kingdom was quiet, but the palace was alive with whispers of candle flames and the soft echo of footsteps on cold stone. Outside, the wind swept through the darkened streets like a restless spirit, carrying with it the scent of rain and the faint perfume of the royal gardens. Within the palace walls, power and mystery intertwined, and the Alpha King lay in his chamber, a figure as still as the shadows that clung to the corners of the room. He did not sleep. Every breath, every blink, was calculated, deliberate. The guards patrolling the halls believed him to be asleep, and even the court servants thought the same. But the king, known for his iron will and unshakable rule, had a secret plan. Tonight, he would test the new maid who had just arrived in his household. Her name was Ilara. She was young but carried herself with quiet strength, moving through the palace like a calm current in a stormy sea. Her hair was dark and soft, her eyes alert and curious, but she had a humility that kept her unnoticed by most. She believed her place in the palace was small, her duties simple: clean, arrange, and obey. Yet there was something in her that drew the king's attention, a spark of courage, a purity of heart that he had not seen in years. He had watched her since her arrival, silently observing how she treated the lowly servants, how she moved with respect through the halls, and how her gaze never lingered on riches or power. To him, she seemed almost otherworldly, a rare flicker of light in a palace often shrouded in darkness. Now, he would test her. The king pretended to sleep, lying still beneath the heavy covers of his bed, his face hidden in the dim light of the flickering candles. Every muscle in his body was relaxed, but his mind was alert, measuring, calculating. Would she respect his privacy, or would curiosity betray her? Would her courage falter in the presence of one as feared as he was? Ilara entered the chamber softly, her footsteps careful on the polished floor. She carried a small tray with fresh water and linens, as was her nightly task. She paused for a moment, bowing her head respectfully to the sleeping figure of the king. She had never been this close to him before, and even now, her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of duty and the unknowable aura that surrounded him. The king watched, unseen. As she placed the tray on the side table, straightened the linens, and adjusted the heavy curtains to let the moonlight spill gently across the room, she moved with care, not a single gesture careless, and her presence filled the room with a quiet grace. Then her gaze fell on a small object lying on the king's desk. It was a charm, delicate and worn, a relic from the late queen. Most would ignore it, afraid to touch anything that belonged to royalty. But Ilara's fingers hovered over it for a moment, and then, almost reverently, she picked it up. She whispered softly, words that the king could not hear but that carried a weight of kindness and hope. She traced her fingers over the charm, and then, with a gentle smile, set it back exactly where it had been. The king's chest tightened. That simple act, so small, and yet so profound, stirred a strange warmth in him, a feeling he had long buried beneath years of duty, suspicion, and solitude. For a moment, he allowed himself to wonder if trust could ever exist again, if someone could truly see him, not the king, but the man behind the crown. But the moment was fleeting. A sudden shadow moved across the corridor outside, and the faintest whisper of a threat slipped through the stone walls. The king's hand went to the hilt of his dagger beneath the covers, his senses sharp. The test was not over. Danger had entered his palace, and he could not ignore it. Ilara, unaware of the presence in the corridor, continued her task. She moved to the window, drawing it slightly open to let in the cool night air. She paused, looking out over the gardens below, where silver moonlight danced on the leaves and the fountain glimmered like liquid crystal. For a moment, her thoughts drifted away from the palace, away from the shadows, and she allowed herself to imagine life beyond these walls, a life where courage and kindness were enough to protect her. The king, hidden beneath the sheets, watched her every movement. He noticed the way her shoulders straightened as she balanced the tray, the way her eyes softened when she spoke to the sleeping cats that wandered the chamber. the way her heart seemed to shine in small acts of care. Each gesture, each breath, revealed a strength he had thought lost in the world, a strength that could not be commanded, bought, or forced. But the shadow outside was growing. He could feel it pressing against the palace, a darkness born from the cursed forests that bordered the kingdom. The curse had lingered for generations, creeping closer with every moon cycle, threatening the royal bloodline. The king's test of Alara now took on a new urgency. It was no longer just about trust or obedience. It was about survival. Could she face danger without faltering? Could she act with courage when the palace itself was under threat? As Alara turned back from the window, she sensed a chill in the air, an unnatural presence that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She paused, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the tray, and listened. The corridor was silent, yet the stillness felt heavy, almost alive. "Is someone there?" she whispered softly, more to herself than to the shadows. The king held his breath, measuring. Her voice was steady, calm, yet laced with the instinctive caution that came from a heart unafraid of what it did not understand. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the first test of courage, not of obedience. Alara stepped closer to the corridor, curiosity tempered by caution. Her hand hovered over the dagger she kept hidden at her belt, a precaution she had taken since arriving at the palace. Though she was small and unarmed compared to the guards or the king himself, she had a presence that made even the unseen shadows hesitate. The king's heart, so long armored, trembled. He realized that this girl, this simple maid, carried something he had not felt in decades. Fear, tempered by courage, humility tempered by wisdom, and strength tempered by compassion. He wanted to call out, to reveal himself and see her reaction. But the test was not yet complete. Instead, he watched as she took a slow, deliberate step toward the shadow. Her eyes scanning the hall, her mind alert, her body poised. She did not run, she did not scream, she did not falter, and in that instant, the king felt an ache in his chest, a longing he had buried beneath crowns and battles, a desire for trust and loyalty that could not be forced but had to be earned. Alara returned to her task, placing the tray back on the table and adjusting the linens one last time. She paused again at the queen's charm, this time bowing her head in a silent prayer. The king's eyes filled with tears he did not allow himself to shed in public. The test had begun as a trial of obedience, but it had revealed something far deeper, something that might change the course of his life. Outside, the wind howled through the empty streets, and the palace seemed to hold its breath. The king knew that this night was only the beginning. The shadow in the corridor was not the only threat. The curse that haunted the royal bloodline was awakening, and with it, dangers that even he could not foresee. But in the quiet courage of a young maid, he had glimpsed a light strong enough to face the darkness. He closed his eyes briefly, pretending to sleep. But his mind was alive, with thoughts he had not dared to entertain for decades. Could he trust her? Could he allow himself to be seen not as the king, but as a man longing for connection? And most importantly, could he survive the night and the trials to come, with her by his side? For the first time in years, he felt something fragile and dangerous take root in his heart. Hope. Cliffhanger. As the clock in the tower struck midnight, a sudden movement in the corridor caught the maid's eye. She froze, her breath shallow. Outside, something dark and unseen approached, its intentions unknown. The king, still pretending to sleep, felt a surge of protectiveness he could no longer hide. Tonight, his test of trust would turn into a test of survival for both of them. The night lingered in the palace long after the king had pretended to sleep. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves in the royal gardens, carrying with it a sense of unease. The moon hung high, casting silver light over the stone walls, and shadows danced like living things. In the corridors, the faint echo of footsteps, or perhaps something darker, whispered against the cold stones. Alara had not returned to her quarters yet. The movement in the corridor had unsettled her, a shadowy presence that seemed more than just a trick of the candlelight. Her pulse quickened, Yet she did not panic. She had learned, in the days she had served the palace, that fear could be a teacher if one allowed it to guide rather than control. She moved cautiously, her hands brushing over the walls for balance, her eyes alert for any sign of threat. The palace, though grand and beautiful, carried centuries of history. And with that history came secrets that even the king did not fully know. Strange sounds echoed from the walls. A faint whisper, the creak of ancient wood, the soft sigh of drafts slipping through cracks in the stone. Meanwhile, the Alpha King lay in his chamber, listening. He had risen only slightly, enough to see her silhouette moving through the hall. Her courage had already proven itself once, but now he wondered, could she withstand the dangers he had not yet revealed? The curse that haunted his family, a shadowed and ancient force, was awakening. Its whispers had begun to stir in the depths of the palace, drawn to weakness, to fear, and to power. For generations, his bloodline had carried a secret, a darkness that would return to claim the throne if the royal heir faltered. It was not a curse of simple misfortune, but a living, breathing shadow that sought to consume all that the king loved. And now, it was stirring once more. Ilara stopped at the entrance to the garden. The moonlight spilled over the fountain, glinting on the water like scattered diamonds. She took a deep breath, sensing the tension in the air. Something unnatural was near, something that did not belong to the quiet palace night. Her hand rested on a small pendant at her neck, a gift from her mother long ago, imbued with a simple charm for protection. It was not magic, not in the way of the kingdom, but it was enough to steady her courage. A sudden rustle from the shadows made her spin. There was nothing there. Yet the feeling of being watched, of being tested by something unseen, pressed upon her chest. She whispered a prayer under her breath, her voice soft but firm. "Let the light guide me." From the shadows of the corridor, the king observed, his heart beating faster than it had in years. He had spent a lifetime building walls, training himself to expect betrayal, guarding against danger from all sides. Yet he could not shield himself from the raw bravery of a young maid. He saw her stand tall in the garden, facing something he could not yet name. And for the first time, he felt a pang of hope. Perhaps this girl, so seemingly ordinary, could survive where others might fall. The next morning, the palace awoke to a new tension. The servants whispered in hushed tones, unsure whether the disturbances of the night were dreams or omens. The king met them all with calm authority, concealing the unease in his heart. But his eyes found Ilara immediately, and he noticed the subtle changes in her demeanor. She moved with a quiet confidence now, her steps lighter, her gaze sharper. Whatever had stirred in the night had not shaken her, it had strengthened her. The king summoned her to the private library under the pretense of delivering scrolls. The room smelled of old parchment and wax, a place of knowledge and secrets. He had never invited her here before, and even the walls seemed to hum with anticipation. "Ilara," he said, his voice low and steady, "these scrolls must be delivered to the council chamber. But take care they contain knowledge not meant for curious hands." She inclined her head respectfully, but her eyes, bright and fearless, met his. "I will be careful, Your Majesty," she said, her tone sincere. There was no false humility, no unnecessary fear, only honesty and poise. As she reached for the scrolls, a flicker of shadow moved across the window, and a chill ran through the room. The king stiffened, sensing the growing presence of the curse. It was drawn to fear, to hesitation, to weakness, but Ilara had none of these. Instead, she stood steady, her heart calm, her mind clear. He studied her silently, feeling the strange pull of emotion he could no longer deny. She was brave, compassionate, intelligent, everything he had thought lost in his world of betrayal and political intrigue. And yet, he could not allow himself to be fully seen, not yet. The walls of his heart were high, fortified over decades. Outside, in the palace gardens, the shadow of the curse shifted, sensing the connection between the king and the maid. It moved like liquid darkness, curling through the stones, finding cracks, listening, waiting. The king could feel its presence even from the library, a heavy weight pressing at the edges of his mind. He had fought many battles in his life, but this was different. This was not an army, not a rebellion. This was an ancient force that sought to break his soul. Elara returned the scrolls to him, her hands steady, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. The king, moved by her courage and grace, felt an ache in his chest, a longing he had buried long ago. He wanted to speak, to warn her, to protect her, but he remained silent. He could not yet reveal the danger that stalked them, not until he understood whether she could face it. Days passed, and the palace felt a growing tension. Strange whispers echoed in the corridors. Objects moved without explanation, and shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. Elara, attuned to the world in ways the king had not expected, began to sense the unnatural presence. She spoke quietly to herself as she walked the halls, murmuring prayers and blessings, moving with care but never with fear. The king watched her, amazed by her intuition and courage. She had not yet faced the full force of the curse, yet she had sensed its presence. Acknowledging it without panic, he realized that the test he had planned, simple obedience and respect, was no longer enough. This maid, this young woman of quiet strength, would be more than a servant in his household. She might become his partner in a battle that was both personal and supernatural. One evening, as the sun set and the palace was bathed in golden light, the king called her to the balcony, overlooking the gardens. The air was warm, the scent of jasmine and roses drifting on the breeze. He did not speak at first, only observed her as she leaned lightly on the railing, gazing at the horizon. "Elara," he said finally, his voice carrying a weight she had not heard before, "you have shown strength beyond what I expected. But the palace is not safe. There are forces at work here, ancient forces, that even I struggle to control." She turned to him, eyes wide but steady. "I will not run, Your Majesty," she said softly. "I may be a servant, but I am not afraid of what I do not understand. And I will do what I can to help." The king's chest tightened. He had expected fear, submission, or hesitation, but not this. Her courage was raw, honest, and unshakable. He felt emotions he had long denied: hope, admiration, and, most unexpectedly, something deeper. Something that reached past the walls of duty and into the realm of the heart. Suddenly, the wind shifted, carrying with it a darkness that seemed almost alive. The shadows in the gardens lengthened unnaturally, curling like smoke around the fountains and statues. The king instinctively stepped in front of her, hand on the hilt of his hidden dagger, sensing that the curse had come closer, drawn to their proximity. Elara, however, did not flinch. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment, and whispered a prayer. The shadows seemed to recoil slightly, as if acknowledging her bravery. The king watched, his heart breaking and mending at the same time. Here was a human being, small and fragile, standing against darkness, with nothing but courage and faith. And he realized, painfully, that he could no longer pretend to be indifferent. Cliffhanger. The night deepened, and the palace walls trembled with a force unseen. Elara sensed movement behind her, and when she turned, her eyes widened. Something dark and ancient had entered the gardens, a shadow that even the king's eyes could barely trace. The Alpha King, standing protectively beside her, felt an emotion he could not name: fear, for the first time in years, mingled with something far stronger. Tonight, the battle of courage, loyalty, and heart would truly begin. The palace had become a place of shadows and whispers. Every corner seemed alive, every hallway filled with unspoken threats. The curse that had lingered in the bloodline of the Alpha King for generations had grown stronger, feeding on fear and uncertainty. Even the king, who had faced countless battles, felt the weight of its presence pressing against his chest. Yet, standing beside him, Elara did not waver. She had proven herself brave in ways no one expected. The king had watched her for weeks, first in secret, then with cautious admiration. As she moved through the palace, sensing the dangers no ordinary servant could notice. Her courage was quiet, but fierce, and it unsettled him. In the long years of rule, he had believed no one could understand the burdens he carried, the darkness he fought nightly within himself. And yet here was Alara, fearless and steady, seeing not just the king, but the man beneath the crown. That evening, the king summoned her to the library once more. The scrolls he had given her before were gone, replaced with others' documents detailing ancient knowledge of the curse and its origins. The library was quiet, the only sound the crackle of the fireplace. Shadows flickered across the high ceilings, and the air felt heavy, almost alive. "Alara," the king began, his voice unusually soft. "The palace is not safe. The curse grows stronger. It is drawn to weakness, fear, and hidden desires. You have already sensed its presence, and yet you remain calm. I must know why you are not afraid." Alara met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "I do not know if I am brave, Your Majesty. Perhaps I am simply aware that fear will not help me. The curse will come regardless of my hesitation. But courage gives me the strength to act, even when I do not fully understand what is before me." The king's chest tightened. Her words were simple, but they pierced through walls he had built over decades. She spoke of courage not as a weapon, but as a quiet force, an inner light that could guide her through darkness. He realized that this maid, this young woman, carried a power stronger than most knights or soldiers, a heart that refused to bend to fear. Before he could respond, the shadows in the room flickered unnaturally. A sudden chill swept through the library, and the fire guttered, casting the room into near darkness. The curse had found them, drawn by the bond forming between the king and the maid. Alara instinctively stepped forward, placing herself slightly in front of the king. "It is here," she whispered, her voice calm but urgent. "I can feel it. The darkness moves with purpose." The king's hand went to the hilt of the dagger hidden beneath his robes, but he found his mind distracted. The presence of the curse, combined with the fearless composure of Alara, stirred emotions he had long denied. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from all the shadows in the world, yet he knew that she might be the one capable of facing it. The shadows coalesced near the doorway, forming a shape that seemed almost human, yet twisted and unreal. It moved like smoke, curling and writhing, and the temperature in the room dropped. The king stepped forward, but before he could draw the dagger, Alara raised a hand. "Wait," she said softly. "This darkness feeds on anger and fear. If we respond with those, it will overwhelm us. But if we remain steady, it may not harm us." The king hesitated, then nodded. Together, they faced the shadow, standing side by side, hearts aligned in silent understanding. The curse seemed to hesitate, sensing the unusual strength between them, the calm courage of Alara and the king's resolve to protect her. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Then, almost imperceptibly, the darkness began to retreat, dissolving into the corners of the library. The fire flared back to life, warming the room, and the shadows returned to their normal shapes. The king exhaled slowly, the tension in his body easing just slightly. "You were remarkable," he said, voice low and filled with awe. "I did not believe anyone could face this and remain unshaken." Alara looked at him, her eyes softening. "Perhaps the darkness is not the only thing that tests us. Sometimes, it is the courage we find in each other that matters more." The king felt a strange warmth in his chest. For years, he had been alone, believing that trust and affection were luxuries he could not afford. Yet now, standing beside this young maid, he understood that connection was a form of strength, not weakness. Her presence had illuminated a part of him he thought had died long ago. In the days that followed, the king continued his subtle tests. He placed challenges before her delicate trials of intelligence, morality, and perception. Yet with every test, Alara proved herself not only capable but wise. She questioned, observed, and acted with a calm that impressed even the king's hardened mind. He found himself drawn to her in ways he could not name, the bond between them deepening with every passing day. One evening, he found her alone in the palace garden. The moon hung low, casting silver light over the fountains and flowers. She was kneeling near the edge of the marble path, her hands resting on the earth, whispering softly as if speaking to something unseen. The king watched quietly, not wanting to interrupt, yet unable to tear his gaze away. He had never seen anyone speak to the world in such a way, so gentle, so certain, so alive. He felt an ache in his chest, a longing he had suppressed for decades. "Elara," he said finally, stepping into the moonlight. She looked up, startled, but did not rise immediately. There was a respect in her stance, a patience that drew him closer without words. "You have faced much in the palace," he continued, "more than any servant should. And yet, you continue to move with courage. I must ask, why?" She met his eyes, unflinching. "Because it is right. Because fear alone cannot guide us. And because I believe that even in darkness, there is something worth protecting." The king felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Her words were simple, but they struck him with the force of truth. In that moment, he realized that the test he had planned, the test of her loyalty, obedience, and courage, was no longer necessary. She had passed, not because he judged her, but because she had proven her strength through her own choices. Yet even as he felt this, a shadow moved at the edge of the garden. The curse was not gone. It had merely shifted, waiting, watching, sensing the growing bond between them. The king instinctively stepped in front of her, ready to defend. But he knew that this was more than a battle of swords. It was a battle of hearts, courage, and the strength to remain steadfast in the face of darkness. "Elara," he said softly, "the danger is near. I cannot promise safety, but I will stand with you." She rose, brushing her hands on her skirts. "Then we stand together, Your Majesty. Not as master and servant, but as two who face what comes with courage." The king's heart ached with emotion. He had never allowed anyone this close, never allowed anyone to see both the man and the king. And yet here she was, unafraid, steady, and willing to face the unknown by his side. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the garden, carrying with it a voice that seemed to whisper from the shadows. The king felt a shiver run down his spine. The curse had sensed their connection and was drawn to it. It would not wait. The confrontation was inevitable, and they had little time to prepare. Cliffhanger. A figure of darkness emerged from the trees, its form shifting like smoke, its eyes glinting with intent. Elara drew herself tall, meeting the shadow without fear. The king, for the first time, felt something entirely new. A fierce protectiveness, not just for the kingdom, but for the maid who had touched his heart. The battle of courage, trust, and love was about to begin. The darkness had fully descended on the palace gardens. Shadows twisted unnaturally around the fountains, the marble paths, and the flowers. The cursed force, ancient and relentless, had come to claim what it believed was owed: the heart of the Alpha King. Its presence pressed on the night like a living weight, cold and suffocating, as if the world itself had fallen silent in fear. The king stood before it, the weight of the crown heavy on his shoulders, and yet lighter than the burden he carried in his heart. Beside him, Elara moved with calm courage, her eyes steady, her hands ready to act if needed. They were no longer master and servant in this moment. They were allies, two souls bound by trust, standing against a darkness older than the kingdom itself. "Stay close," the king whispered. His voice carried both command and vulnerability. He was not used to showing weakness, yet he could not deny the fear that prickled at his chest. The curse sensed it, and it recoiled slightly, waiting for him to falter. Elara nodded, stepping nearer. "We face it together." she said, voice unwavering. Whatever comes, we will not let it control us. The shadows writhed, coalescing into a form tall and jagged, with eyes like burning coal and a presence that seemed to consume light itself. The curse spoke, a voice that echoed in the mind rather than through sound, testing their resolve. Your blood is mine. Your heart belongs to the darkness. The king's grip on his hidden dagger tightened, but he felt a surge of something more powerful. Determination. Born not of fear or hatred, but of protection. His gaze met Alara's, and in that brief glance, an unspoken understanding passed between them. The power of the curse could not break courage. It could not undo trust. Alara stepped forward first, raising her hands in a gesture of calm defiance. We do not belong to fear, she said firmly. We choose light, we choose courage, and we choose each other. The shadow recoiled, hissing like wind through dead branches. Its power, drawn from centuries of darkness and despair, met resistance unlike any before. The bond between king and maid, forged through trust and small acts of bravery, radiated like a beacon, a force the curse had not accounted for. The king found himself speaking aloud, words he had kept locked within for years. I am not yours, he said. I am a man who has faced battles and betrayals, yet I will not surrender to you. And neither will she. The curse surged forward, striking at the edges of their resolve, twisting the air with cold that burned, shadows that clawed, and whispers that questioned their worth. Alara did not falter. She stood firmly, eyes shining with determination. She whispered again, softly, words of blessing and hope, drawing strength not from power, but from the courage within her own heart. Something shifted. The darkness faltered, sensing that its hunger could not prevail against such unity. The king reached out, taking her hand in his. A simple touch that conveyed everything words could not. Trust, gratitude, and an emotion he had denied himself for far too long. Love. Together, they faced the shadow, their courage intertwined. The curse shrieked in frustration, its form splintering into jagged pieces, each one recoiling at the light of human determination and loyalty. The king and Alara moved as one, not through magic or force, but through unyielding heart. The struggle seemed endless, but gradually, the darkness began to dissolve, retreating into the corners of the garden, leaving behind only faint wisps like smoke in the dawn. The chill lifted, and the air warmed once more. The palace, though still heavy with ancient history, seemed lighter, freer than it had been for decades. The king sank to his knees, exhaustion heavy on his body, but his heart felt strangely unburdened. Alara knelt beside him, brushing a stray lock of hair from his face, her eyes filled with relief and quiet triumph. You saved us, the king said, voice raw, not with strength of sword or command, but with courage. You were the light the palace needed. Alara shook her head softly, a small smile on her lips. We saved each other, she said. You taught me courage in your own way, and I showed you trust. The king felt tears prick at his eyes. He had spent a lifetime believing that no one could truly understand him, that his heart was too guarded, too burdened by legacy and shadow. And yet here she was, a young maid with no title, no power but her own heart, standing beside him with the strength to face what he could not alone. He took both her hands in his, gripping them gently but firmly. I have spent years as a king, ruling with iron and strategy, believing that fear and control were the only ways to survive. But you have shown me something I forgot existed. Hope, trust, love. Alara's eyes softened, reflecting the moonlight that bathed the garden. You are not alone anymore, she said. The palace may hold shadows, but you do not have to face them by yourself, and neither do I. The king smiled faintly, a smile that had been rare and hesitant for decades. He rose to his feet, drawing her up with him. Around them, the palace seemed to breathe once more, the oppressive weight of history lifting slightly, as if acknowledging their triumph. But it was not only the curse that had been defeated, it was the walls around his heart. For years, he had believed that emotion was dangerous, That vulnerability invited pain, but in facing the darkness with Alara, he had learned that courage could be shared, that trust could strengthen even the strongest man. They walked together through the palace corridors, their steps in sync, their presence calm yet unshakable. The servants watched in awe, sensing the change not only in the king but in the bond between him and the maid. Where once there had been distance, formality, and fear, there was now respect, trust, and something far deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. In the royal chambers, the king finally allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. He turned to Alara, tears glistening in his eyes. "You have saved me," he said quietly. "Not just my life, but my heart. I never believed that I could feel this again. Yet here I am, because of you." Alara stepped closer, her hand resting on his cheek. "You allowed yourself to be brave," she said softly. "Not just for me, but for yourself. That is what made this possible." The king swallowed hard, the weight of emotion nearly overwhelming him. He had faced countless battles, wielded power over life and death, yet he had never felt a victory as profound as this. It was not a victory over enemies, nor over the curse. It was a victory over fear, over isolation, over the walls he had built around his heart. He knelt, taking her hands in his again, his voice steady despite the tears. "Alara, you are more than a servant. You are my partner, my equal, and the one who has shown me the strength of true courage. I will not allow another day to pass without acknowledging what you mean to me." Ilara's eyes shone with tears of her own, not of fear, but of understanding and hope. "And you have shown me something as well," she whispered. "That courage and loyalty can exist even in a world that seems ruled by shadows. That even a king, feared and bound by legacy, can choose love and trust." The palace, once a place of shadows and secrets, seemed to echo their words, the walls themselves holding the promise of a new era. The curse, though ancient and relentless, had been faced and overcome not by power, but by the courage of two hearts, united in trust and love. The king rose fully, taking her hand, and led her to the balcony where the first light of dawn began to touch the gardens. The moonlight faded into the soft gold of morning, and the palace seemed to awaken, lighter, freer, renewed. He looked at her, tears still glistening on his cheeks, and whispered the truth he had long denied. "Alara, you have saved me in every way that matters. My heart, my soul, they belong to you," she smiled softly, leaning close. "And mine to you, Your Majesty, not as a maid, not as a servant, but as someone who has shared this trial with you, as someone who trusts you with everything." The king, Alpha of the kingdom, once feared and unapproachable, felt a peace he had never known. In the courage, trust, and loyalty of a single human heart, he had found redemption not through power, nor conquest, nor strategy, but through love. Together, they stood on the balcony, the palace behind them bathed in the first light of a new day. The curse had been broken, the walls of isolation had fallen, and the king, once alone, finally allowed himself to be truly seen, truly vulnerable, and truly alive.